Hey guys, Gamed is back with the third game for the month of March, and things are about to get intense. Since Ruin the Glow was a very calm and relaxed game, we found ourselves leaning towards making a game that would have heavy mechanics focus. Maybe something with a lot of action, a genre we haven't explored before. So, we present to you Boneyard. Boneyard is a 2D action slasher game where you fight waves of enemies to see if you can survive. Since this game had so much that we haven't done before, it was the perfect learning opportunity for so many aspects of game making. But the biggest one of all was creating the combat. Now, combat is a combination of a variety of factors: the movement, the animations, the enemy AI, and ultimately how it all comes together to create the game feel. So, let's get into it one by one and explore it in depth. Action games rely a lot on the fluidity of movement of the player, and we wanted to make sure that we captured that. We worked first on figuring out what will be the camera angle that we wanted our game to be from. Maybe something top down like Binding of Isaac, or the isometric view of Bastion or Transistor, or something like Castle Crashers. Maybe something completely different. There were a lot of options, so the best way to approach this was just to test it all out once we had a simple WASD movement implemented. This prototyping helped us zone in on making this game in a hybrid side view with depth movement available. To align the view of the characters in the 3D space, we used a billboarding technique. It makes the characters face the camera regardless of the orientation of the camera. Looks a little funky outside of the camera view, but it works. Next step was to make the objects feel like they have 3-dimensionality. After all, these are just 2D sprites. To achieve a believable depth, we ended up giving objects a shadow that corresponded to the collider size. It gave players a good idea of what the size of the object in the game world is, so that they can plan their moves better. After all, this is a game about movement. We also wanted our player to have slightly bigger moveset than just running around in different directions. So for that, we gave her a dash ability, a time in which she is invulnerable and can use it as a way to navigate within the environment. With the movement of the player set on this side, our next task was animation. For any action game, the animations need to be perfectly balanced. Taking inspiration from games like Hollow Knight, we knew that enemy attacks needed a lot of anticipation frames while hero attacks needed to feel snappy. For this, we made sure that each enemy attack has 4 to 6 frames of anticipation so that it gives the player enough time to evade the attack. On the other hand, the player attack is almost instantaneous. While these may seem like simple considerations, our hope is that it helps elevate the game feel. For the boss enemy, we decided to give it a longer charge animation to get the player to prepare for evasion. We also gave him 3 different attack animations depending on which behavior it is exhibiting. This helped with the readability of the enemy as well as to give the player the feeling of threat. If the characters are just translated in the plane, it felt more like they're sliding rather than actually floating. But our enemies are floating in the air, and to simulate that feeling, we made a bobbing effect on all of them. Just a simple sine wave on the Y component. For the boss, we tried to give different parts of the boss the bobbing effect separately to give it an even more dynamic feel. Now with all that done, all that's left is to get the enemy to act, and for that, we need to build AI for the enemies. There are 2 different parts to enemy behavior. The first one is the movement. In the first few iterations of our game, we had obstacles on the map that the player would need to navigate. And while these added interesting variations on the map, they increased the complexity for the enemy movement. Ultimately, we decided that the enemy will know the location of the player and simply move towards it. All 4 enemies have different attack behaviors to give a feeling of complexity within the AI. While slow-moving skulls will chase and then basically continue to do the chomp animation, the Plague Doctor will approach the player, attack, and then take a step back, and repeat. We wanted to give the boss enemy multiple attacks with huge anticipation animations. We ended up using Unity's animator to control most of the boss behavior. We clubbed the anticipation animation where the orbs are forming and the hand flicks that release the attack. As soon as the attack is over, the animation control goes back into an idle state, which calls a function in the boss script, which randomizes the next attack, and so it goes. And each one of these attacks, there is a corresponding movement. Tying both of these together made the boss behavior pattern work as we wanted. Once these different aspects were taken care of, all we needed to do was to bring them all together. Take the shooting enemy as an example. We started with an enemy design, which shot projectiles at the player. But because of the way the camera angle was set, the location of the orb was very hard to decipher. We ultimately could not communicate how high an orb was. So we ended up making it work as a spread out shooter. But that made the gameplay all about positioning and very little about the combat. So ultimately, when we brought the enemy behavior to a machine gun styled continuous attack, that gave the enemy that snappy, dangerous feel. After all, it is the second strongest enemy in terms of health pool in the game. Small things like adding shadows on the attacks of the shooting enemy also help the player get an idea of the position, and in turn, this increases the readability of the game. Ultimately, it was a collection of many such changes done in small ways across a lot of different areas which helped us create the game. And so here it is. While making both of the previous games was also an uphill battle, this was probably the first time when it felt like we bit off a bit more than we could chew. From the fact that this was my first time making animations to Charu's first time implementing a combat system or enemy AI system, there were so many moving variables. Ultimately, we do feel like we were able to create a cohesive game, but ideally, we would have wanted to playtest the game a lot more and to make gameplay changes accordingly. And this is precisely the kind of lessons we want to learn from this Game a Month project. To push what we think is possible, to figure out the limits. Our biggest lesson from this month was to not underestimate how technical complexities can pile on top of each other and reduce the pace. The most exciting thing to come out of it was that both of us pushed ourselves with the combat system and building a game that we wouldn't have thought possible to make even 3 months back. This has been a slightly exhausting but extremely rewarding project. Stay tuned for the game that we will come up with next month. Links to the games are in the description, and do comment below with your games. We would love to check them out. I am Divya, and together with my sister, we made Boneyard for our 6-month project's third game. Halfway through. See you next time.